So this is the community panel. We all kind of represent different ways of building communities, interacting with communities. And the way we're going to be doing this is first we're going to talk amongst ourselves for about 45 minutes. And then there will be a whistle blow, and then we'll open for questions from you. So if you have questions as we're going, please do write them down, and we'll be able to come back to you after we're done talking. So maybe we can just do little introductions on ourselves, just so people can have an idea of what our backgrounds are. Again, my name is Nat Roe. I work in two different community spaces. I'm a co-founder of Silent Barn, which is currently located in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I'm also the executive director of Flux Factory in Long Island City, Queens. So both of those spaces are kind of similar in that they're collectively driven spaces that have public events, and there's also an internal community that guides what goes on there. And Wayne, do you want to go next?
Yeah. My name is Wayne Hodge. I am an artist who for many years I was based in New York City, particularly in Harlem. In 2012, I was involved in a fight in Harlem over the Harlem Workspace, which was a series of a set of artist studios that were basically put in a Superfund site. So there was a battle in terms of environmental politics and a lot of community building in relation to that. And since 2013, I actually, due to being priced out of Harlem, have been living outside of New York City for the past 2 years, but have still been an active member of the arts community in New York City.
Hi there. I'm Ambre Kelly. I'm an artist. I'm also the co-founder of Spring Break Art Show, which is New York's curator-driven art fair that happens during the Armory Art Week. I also run a creative consultancy called the VACO, which serves kind of as a connector for organizations, artists, initiatives to find spaces in New York to use for tactile events.
Shawn McLearen. I am a real estate developer and consultant. I've done work previously for the last 10 years as vice president of art space projects and real estate development, providing portable space to artists and arts organizations. Completed a project, a 90-unit live workspace for artists and their families in the El Barrio community called PS 109, and have recently left art space and started a new nonprofit called Placeful, which is involved in placemaking with communities and also real estate development and consulting for organizations and lenders and investors who care about community space.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Diamond, and I'm an artist, a social practice artist. I work with communities. I just finished a project with LMCC working with middle school students to make audio walking tours from one spot in the Lower East Side all the way to a park in the Lower East Side. But I'm most known for Listings Project, which is my free weekly email of living and work and opportunity space for creative communities and beyond, which I personally curate. So if any of you have posted on Listings Project, we've emailed. Nice to see you.
And I should mention that Chloe Bass is on her way, and we'll sit down and feel. Oh my gosh, here she is. Well, I won't. Maybe I'll give her a minute to get situated, since she already knows what our first question is going to be. And let me maybe help frame this a little bit before we get started with the discussion. When you're looking at displacement, the problems are very easy to see. We see them in front of us every day. It's much more difficult to come up with solutions for these things. This group, I think, is pretty well prepared if there are good answers to these problems. We might have some good ideas of how to get there. When you're looking at communities in particular, we're not necessarily talking about individuals who have a lot of means in themselves. A lot of the communities that we represent are lower income. But one of the big powers there is numbers, right? And we have these communities who have lots of people who care, who are very knowledgeable, and who want to organize and make their problems visible. So communities sometimes, armed with these things, really can make progress against the forces of displacement. Sometimes we actually win against the forces of displacement and manage to, have something that's our own. Sometimes, not as much. Communities don't always win. So I was thinking, maybe if we could take a look at what are some of the examples, either in our own work or things that we've, been exposed to. When have communities won in the past, and what did they do right, and how can we get more of that? Does anyone want to start off with that question?
Hi, I'm going to introduce myself first, is what we've agreed. My name is Chloe Bass. I am very late on average. I apologize to all of you. I am an artist, independent artist, and native New Yorker, but also spent 5 years co-leading Arts in Bushwick, which produces Bushwick Open Studios. And so I don't currently feel that I represent a community, although I've been working in and around my current community of Bed-Stuy, but do feel that I have some basis to say some things that happened in the past, and New York moves very quickly, so the past does not necessarily accurately reflect the present, and some suggestions that I might have for things that I've seen that don't work, or that work at the expense of others in a way that's really painful.
And I mean, you were one of the people who started Bushwick Open Studios, and it's of course, even as you haven't been involved with it, I mean, that's one of the great things about community building is kind of working yourself out of a job in a way. And what do you think it is that's made that organization and that kind of movement of so many different spaces? What worked there? Why do you think Bushwick Open Studios and Arts in Bushwick has been so successful?
I'm not entirely sure that it is successful, or I'd actually like to turn out the question to everybody, what does success mean and for who and when? I would say that Arts in Bushwick is great at getting bigger, and if we're defining success as getting bigger, then we nailed it, totally rocked it out, that's going great. If we want to define success along other metrics, I don't necessarily always think that the organization is either sustainable for its leadership and membership or for the neighborhood that it represents or claims to represent. So thinking about that is kind of important to me. But one of the things that I would definitely say is successful in terms of longevity or growing has been actually not investing in real estate. And this is something that you and I talked about a little bit, Nat, is the instability of needing to pay rent every month. I would say that is my main instability as an artist, and I think it's a lot of organizations' main instabilities as well. That having been said, some organizations need space to do the type of programming that they do. So figuring out how to kind of work within that and to accept that real estate here costs way too much. My mother is an immigrant, and she moved here to go to Cooper Union. And when she moved here she's also older. She doesn't mind me saying this. She's 70 years old. And when she moved here to attend Cooper Union, she got an apartment on 7th Street between Bowery and 2nd, and she was paying $79 a month. So although she had never really spent time in the United States, didn't really have a job, didn't really have an income plan, it was possible for her to succeed and survive in school, focusing on education and being an artist here in New York, in Manhattan. That is no longer the case, right? That's not the case for individuals. That's not the case for studios. That's not the case for organizations. I don't see a time when that's going to become the case. And so trying to figure out other ways to kind of organize around that can lead to certain types of success. And in that way, I would say that Arts in Bushwick, as an organization that mobilizes collections of outside space, which have various levels of investment in participating, some of which I am happier about than others. Still, that's a successful model to a certain extent.
Well, I mean, just certainly, it's interesting to hear kind of some of the ways in which it's not successful, maybe. I mean, certainly it creates the appearance of there just being all these different spaces, right? Bushwick, even Open Studios, you see more spaces every year, so it creates this appearance of lots of availability. Stephanie, maybe then I could move to you, where the Listings project is just constantly pointing out, new studios, and it kind of, might in a way kind of convey just availability. There's just always more. And do you think that this is, is this the case? Have you observed that things are getting more difficult? Have you observed progress? What do you, what is your assessment of this large network of spaces?
Well, there's definitely a lot of space in New York. It doesn't necessarily mean we can inhabit it or work in it. I mean, when I look around, there's big buildings being put up constantly. So it's interesting who is in those spaces. What I've noticed recently on Listings project is a lot of young artists are actually living in really nice spaces. The Williamsburg kind of glass and metal buildings that are going up in Greenpoint. And I think that those were potentially intended for very wealthy people, but they're not necessarily in there. So there's a lot of people living there with roommates. So I'm noticing some really nice looking apartments on the list recently. But in terms of art spaces, in terms of workspaces, Bushwick and Bed-Stuy have been the biggest trend. I've also noticed that net leases, so when an artist has an idea to rent a raw space and get a net lease, which means you rent the raw space and you do whatever you want with it for many years. You rent from the landlord, but when you do that, you become a landlord. So artists get net leases on spaces, then they rent the spaces out, break it down, rent it out to artists. Does that make sense? A lot of those net leases have finished. And so the original landlords have taken back those spaces, and potentially they were thinking to put housing or knock down the buildings, but they have realized that artists can give them money. So a lot of people who didn't necessarily intend to make artist space are. So there's a lot of interesting landlords that I'm finding on Listings project, and more spaces opening up. So people are capitalizing on artists. In terms of living, I'm noticing that a lot of artists are living together more. So there's a lot of married couples that are living, renting out a room and living with a roommate. But people are constantly innovative with what they're doing with space. That doesn't necessarily mean it's cheaper, but the space is there. It's happening. Things are happening. But the innovation to get in and out of that space is necessary. Does that answer, do you have more from that, or does that answer what you're asking?
Yeah. Well, I guess we're saying that certain strategies of using space, certain motives that those who have space, end up benefiting artists more. And so I guess maybe then we could open up the question: what kinds of partners, what kinds of allies, what kinds of resources do we, are really best to lean on? Amber, I know you've done a good job of kind of activating some public spaces. What do you, and you don't have to necessarily just talk about the public sector, but, in us chatting beforehand, it seemed particularly interesting. What do you think the role is of the public sector as, this force that has a lot of real estate, which is there to, a pretty good extent, support, folks with lower income who couldn't afford these more expensive properties?
Is this on? Yeah. Well, so, it's a challenge always when you're trying to occupy some real estate. What we do with Spring Break is we go in and use underutilized buildings, historic buildings around the city. Obtaining access is pretty much the hardest part of getting into those spaces and having these events there, because the owners want different things, and determining what the owners want is always the challenge, because they're not always going to say, it's not necessarily about money, although nowadays it's becoming more of the trend, but it could be about promoting the space, aligning the building, the owner with cultural initiatives that they want to align with. It's creating awareness, promoting the space, bringing in the right people who could be potential buyers or renters or leasers, leasees. So, it's really, for us, the challenge is who to know, who to talk to, figuring out the agenda, and then implementing. And so that's requiring a lot of infrastructure. Every building is different. Insurance requirements are different, but we have that now. We know how to use those spaces. It's really just like having I was talking to Nat about it earlier, about it would be wonderful to have like a consortium of people like Shawn, who, could offer up, this building is available, it's vacant, let's put it to use, let's get some energy in there, let's use it for cultural initiatives, let's not charge too much for these events to happen so that they can become sustainable throughout. It's really like there's a rubric to figuring out how to use these spaces. And it can be done, and there is a lot of space out there that's sitting there. We just got to figure out how to get in there.
So Nat, can I just intervene for a second? And I'm certainly think it's great, everything that folks have said here. I just do think it's important that we also go forward as artists and utilizers of these spaces, that we have as much information going forward. And my example was not a success story. It was almost the perfect storm of the public and the private sort of coming together to collapse in on a community of artists. And I think it's really important that artists have as many tools as possible to be able to navigate these relationships. The example that, for my example with Workspace Harlem, it was a building between 137 and 138th Streets on very close to the FDR. And the building was originally an ice cream, it was a raw space. It was originally an ice cream factory in like the 1920s, and it spent most of its life until the 1970s as a dry cleaner. And after it was a dry cleaner, it was converted into, the upper levels were converted into a storage space, but there was this weird thing going on where there were all these like really great rooms that were really great studio spaces for artists. The rent was really good. It was one of those situations where the buzz in the neighborhood was that they have these really great spaces and they're really cheap. And I went in for one of these spaces and I had it for a couple of years and it was great until we began to, I noticed strange things happening. So for instance, like one day I go out of my studio space and there are all these holes that are dug into the floor with these PVC pipes hanging out of them. And we start to ask questions and realize that we're sitting on a giant chemical spill. And the only community that this particular landlord was able to rent to was artists, because upon investigating, and this is where this idea of community comes in, right? Because we began to reach out, and the notion of community went way beyond the community of artists. We began to reach out to the residents around, which about 10 years before had fought this very landlord on this space, but nobody knew that because there wasn't enough information shared and there wasn't enough knowledge for us going in. So all the artists in this space, they didn't have leases. They had licensing agreements. So when it came time for us to say, hey, what are our rights under our license agreements, we had no rights. So we had to really build a coalition with We Act, which is an environmental organization that operates primarily in Harlem. And they had fought this thing years before. Apparently the building had been converted to a school at one point, and the air quality was deemed so bad that they closed the school down. So this landlord had gone through all of these different iterations in order to make sure that he could get money every month, but he was running out of options. And the last option on the block was artists. And within the artist community, there was a big schism. We met in forums just like this. We went to the state senator, Bill Perkins, and we had like this open forum. One of our biggest roadblocks was the Department of Environmental Protection. They were supposed to be the ones protecting us, and they were actually working at what we felt was in the landlord's interest. So it wasn't a totally negative experience in the fact that we got to sort of get all of these different community coalitions, former groups that had been tenants there, everything together, and get in this public forum and really kind of make a public record of what was going on. But I think that as much as our artists need to share these types of information, and we need to know what we're getting into, because if not, then there could be a lot of great spaces out there, but those spaces might not ultimately work in the benefit of artists.
I mean,
What happened to the space ultimately? I'm curious.
What happened eventually was that it was very interesting because half of the artists were like, okay, we're leaving, and the other half was like, no, we're staying, because like, and I mean, my decision to leave was informed by the fact that I was trying to start a family, and this chemical was associated with fetal heart defects and low birth weights and things like that, and I just was like, you know what, I need to cut my losses and go. And also, my thinking was that they were remediating the chemical at the time, but the landlord was responsible for paying for that. And he was using the rents from the artists that was, all the cheap rent that we were paying was paying for that remediation. And so once that remediation was done and over, he just started kicking artists out left and right, because we had these like really thin license agreements that could say, so if your rent payment date fell on a weekend, and these are stories that were conveyed to me from other tenants who were there, that you know, if you didn't pay your rent right away, then you wouldn't, like in the past, some people were paying every 3 months. I mean, the rent was, you know, enough so some folks could afford to pay every 3 months. Like, they were getting immediately being taken to court and being evicted. From what I understand now, the space is being used as a school again. And this is another, I mean, going back to community, right? What began to happen is once the artist, that half of the artists, those artists left, then he started getting other tenants. So, and like there was a gym in that building, and there were people there who were working out in that space. And it was a real bone of contention, because we understood that as the people who were running that gym didn't really have the money to open a gym in another building, right? But where does their obligation to inform the people who are working out there that they're being exposed to this chemical, like, what does that mean? They were doing security training, like, so, and they're actually nonprofit organizations that were operating out of this building as well. So, our nonprofit art organizations, I won't name them because they're not here to sort of talk about what their situation is, but, it's just, but the last that I heard, it had been reconverted into a school and was being used as a school again. And this was like really picking hairs, because the original closing of the school was based that the air quality was not suitable for 5-year-olds, but was maybe suitable for adults, maybe suitable for 12-year-olds. Like, I'm not comfortable making that distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is where, as people with various positions of privilege, we're being instrumentalized towards something that we might not want to support. And I think this happens to people because they're artists. I think this happens to people sometimes because they're white or perceived to be white. I think this sometimes happens to people because they're perceived to have a higher level of class or education or bring a particular kind of capital to an area. And while I don't want to send anybody into the tailspin of paralysis that's like, I have to consider every part of my identity and how someone could use it against me, it is also really important to consider that when you're getting a deal, like, that's a fundamentally unstable proposal. And I mean this for living space, I mean this for working space, because ultimately, right, what your story reflects is that the idea of getting this deal is predicated on accepting things that are not good for your health, potentially, or are not good for health of yourself or your neighborhood in ways that are maybe less physical, more metaphorical. I would say that in general, what I've experienced is the willingness of people to offer a temporary deal means that whatever they think that they're losing in money by giving you something for cheap, they are far and away gaining in investment in a way that's very future-oriented. I have a hard time thinking ahead, and this is like my great downfall. I can think ahead like 2 years, maybe 5, but I feel like development in this city thinks ahead 50 years. And so basically, like, if you're thinking ahead only 2 to 5 years, you're not going to find yourself in a very good position in 2 to 5 years. And so I guess the question that I have is, like, what do we do about that, and how do we think more forward?
I do think that, you know, particularly in the last few years, we've really reached a point where artist communities need to think about these sorts of things. They come together, right, to think about art, to just work on art. That's what they care about. But in order for them to be, you know, sustainable, I think we're seeing that there needs to be much more sharing of information. There needs to be much more planning. And, you know, probably those things need to coalesce into some sort of mission-based ownership. Because if the ownership is not in line with the community mission, they're going to separate at some point. Shawn actually is a fantastic example of what planning can do. PS 109 took about 10 years to complete, I believe, and at this point is the mission owns the space and it's going to be there for a while. Do you want to just talk a bit about maybe how that's responded to some of the problems we've identified?
Sure. To take a step back and think a little bit about how we're framing this, I think in my mind as a real estate developer, more specifically as a nonprofit real estate developer, and more specifically as a community developer, to my mind, success ultimately looks more like affordability. So when I think about my work as community development, I think about that as what I do is build community by utilizing the real estate process and real estate finance to be able to provide that affordability to artists, their families, and the community that's invited the project. So if we're not thinking about affordability as something that not only the community within the facility can obtain, but more importantly, thinking about the manner with which that facility and the affordability resonates with the community that also needs that affordability and needs to look at that facility as an example of its affordability, goals, community development agendas. Without that matrix in place, then we tend to fall into zero-sum games where owners are seeking to obtain their gains at the expense of a community like artists who they can utilize for some of those short-term gains in order to not be hit by losses while they're in their operations, while thinking about, as Chloe pointed out, what is their longer-term agenda. So as Nat is, suggesting, when we're thinking more about mission-driven real estate or mission-driven community development, as I think about it, ultimately that comes down to achieving affordability. And in my world, that comes down to financing. And the financing comes down to what types of financing tools do we have available. Either we're going to have a highly philanthropic-oriented individual that wants to spend extraordinary sums of money on a building that will allow for a small number of persons to have a quality of life that is affordable, which maybe we can achieve that. Or we're going to have a series of financing tools that need to be brought to bear so that more of these facilities can be built and have greater quantity of these facilities in our communities. So part of the challenge in that regard, in my experience, comes down to expertise, roles and responsibilities, means and methods, things that real estate developers have to think about so that we can ensure that our public and private partners are willing to come into the project as stakeholders who care about the long-term goals and the long-term sustainability of the facility as a community facility. And so I think if we can be thinking about what does it mean to provide sustainability to our communities as community members of communities that already exist and have their goals in mind, if not fully articulated through the community board, through their elected officials, through their non-elected local leaders that are elders of the community or organizers. There's any number of constituents that we think of as stakeholders. And that somewhere in there, artists, arts organizations, and culturals need to continue to self-identify and do the good work that they do simply by being the creative folk that they are and doing the work that they do, but at the same time being asked by real estate developers or owners and operators like me, what can you do to help us on the community development agenda that we have committed ourselves to? Can I go so far as to put it into my lease agreements with you that you're going to help us achieve this community development goal because you are part of a community that has been here for a long time, and either because you are now a tenant that lived here previously and you are one of our community leaders that's going to help guide our efforts, or because you're moved from one area where you were priced out and you want to live here with this community and you want to help that by understanding more about this community and bringing your mission or your work to bear. In my experience, oftentimes the communities that are in these positions are very suspicious of what it means to have people of any type moving into their community, because in their experience that means somebody's moving out, let alone to have experience around people that are from the creative sector moving in, because they have experience about what that means in terms of the thunderstorm that's on the horizon. And it also has a great deal to do with us as culturals taking responsibility for some of that and managing our own expectations about what it means to be community partners in a short-term agenda for a longer-term community benefit goal. So I think if we think about what success looks like in that longer term, and then find ways to build partnerships across sectors, public and private, as well as find means through which financing tools can be brought to bear that really do provide long-term financial sustainability to facilities that can be passed on to artists, to organizations, and to community groups, then I think we're getting more into a systematic or a system type of approach to issues like displacement, to issues like quality of life in our community, because there are arts, culture, and creatives in every community that have these needs, and we have to find ways to partner with them in ways that resonate with the financing tools that we need to bring to bear, that have their own regulatory requirements involved in them.
I mean, one of the great positions that, we're establishing that there's kind of a new kind of thinking, a new kind of planning that's needed for artists to sustain themselves, within the context of other kinds of communities. There are a lot of very strong people who want to help. I mean, for instance, Bill de Blasio and the city council recently passed a plan that is creating goals for affordable artist housing. Simultaneously, there are kind of more grassroots approaches. The Real Estate Investment Cooperative. That's actually a great one to write down if you haven't heard of it. The Real Estate Investment Cooperative is kind of looking at ways that large numbers of people can get together and kind of crowdsource to get above some of the barriers of entry towards ownership in particular. I guess I can ask another question. One of the things, Chloe, that we had talked about is the importance of proactively reaching out to your neighborhood, and that this is something that I think frequently artist spaces have not done a great job at in the past, and that there's frequently kind of a fragmenting of neighborhoods. And we were kind of talking about how, just on a very, looking at immediate neighborhoods, your immediate blocks, that getting together is a real force to combat some of the issues that we're dealing with. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about
Sure. I mean, I think the context in which that came up was that a lot of arts organizations are often not able to do things above board for various reasons, and those are true challenges that I'm sensitive to. That having been said, I think that there's a lot of communities across the United States that are also not able to do things above board and still have very active histories of community organizing. Particularly what Nat and I were talking about was actually the Dreamers, who were the students, the young students, high school students who were illegal immigrants to the United States who wanted to go to college, who wanted citizen support. And they knew that by becoming public advocates and allies, they risked deportation. So like that's a deeply unstable condition. I can't think of a more unstable condition to start from, to be honest. And yet they still made themselves public with their needs, with their demands, and gained in numbers and actually achieved success. Not only did they achieve success in getting to go to college, and some of them have become citizens, but actually the DREAM Act was passed that helps many more people than the number of people who are organizing reach that goal, right? So that's really, really great. So when artists are saying, like, I feel like I can't do this because I risk my precarious position by stepping forward and saying what I need and what I want, I'm a little bit inherently suspicious of that. Part of me really wonders if New York is not a place that we think about wanting to stay in, but fundamentally accepting that we will have to leave. I was born here, and my whole family that lives in the United States lives in this city. I do not think of this as a place that I'm fundamentally going to want to leave or have to leave, but I think a lot of people have accepted the precondition that it is impossible to stay here. So as much as we might meet and have these gatherings and sort of get fired up and have our consciousness raised in really wonderful ways in this room, we still have this inherent suspicion that this could be a place where we would want to stay and put the effort into staying. So I guess what I would ask people is, like, where do you find the kind of, like, fiery passion that the Dreamers showed us to say, like, I just really want this, and I'm going to do whatever I can do to make sure that that happens. I get that it's super unfair that we have to fight to stay here, but I think that we do. So like maybe accepting that as a precondition could be helpful for some of our own organizing efforts. In terms of directly meeting neighbors, the best thing that Arts in Bushwick, I think, ever did, and it was temporary as it turned out, but was join community board. Community board meetings last for about 72 hours. They're incredibly boring. And they're really terrible, but they're also like hilarious and fascinating, and you get to meet all kinds of people that you probably wouldn't have met anyway, and you just get to show them that you care. So that later when they're trying to say who can come to this table and care, they call you. No one is going to reach out to, like the same way that nobody's going to probably like tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, do you want a show? Do you want a solo show in my Chelsea gallery? Like, not going to happen. Probably nobody's going to reach out to you and like offer you a safe space unless you really put yourself forward. So kind of considering that too.
Oh, we're all done?
That was the whistle. Thanks for doing it between comments. So what that means is that we can now take some questions. And I do think that some of these mics are going to, are we going to take some of ours and bring them down? So maybe just by show of hands, anybody want to go first?
Hi. Ooh. I'm Emily Gallagher. I'm from an organization in Williamsburg and Greenpoint called Neighbors Allied for Good Growth. We are actually founded by an artist who teamed up with a bunch of long-term local residents to fight for environmental justice when these community members started to realize that they were in a very toxic environment. And I have often tried to engage the artist community that currently exists there in our advocacy efforts today, and I've had a difficult time. I want to compliment Nat, because I know that you do work with Northwest Bushwick, who's they're like our sister organization over in Bushwick doing housing and displacement advocacy. And I was moved when Wayne was talking about his environmental justice awakening. And I'm wondering, what does it take to get artists to be invested long-term in the justice efforts of their neighborhoods, especially because I'm looking for strategies myself. So what would it take for you guys to do what Chloe and what Shawn were mentioning of really committing? Because I'm looking for some ideas.
This connects to what you're saying and what you just shared. I'm really interested in the idea of self-care. And so we're speaking about community, but I think before we can really touch on community, it's how are we treating ourselves. So Wayne, you're like, I'm out of here. I want a family. And that enabled you to advocate for yourself within the community. And I think often before we go into a community to advocate, we have to think about how are we taking care of ourselves. And one idea is in the arts is to have artists demand that they're paid. Often artists are saying, I want this housing, I want to live here, but they don't have a salary or they have 5 jobs and they're having a show at a major museum and the museum gives them $500 or $200. So there's an advocacy for the artists to take care of themselves and say, pay me. I'm making your museum exist. So give me some money. Money is major, and we deserve it. Artists are not nonprofits. But if that's not happening, then community organizing is hard, and the commitment is hard if artists are not committing to themselves, or it's confusing, I think. I don't have specific ideas for you other than it's great you're here so you can talk to us, we know you exist, and we can start making connections. I feel like showing up and being part of a community with humans helps with that, other than being on Facebook and stuff like that.
I just wanted to add to that. I think I do agree that it's a big deal of it is about money. It's about being able to stay in the neighborhood that you want to advocate for. But on another level, I think it's important that we don't just look at it as an artist's problem, right? Because from that experience, what I was really shocked and was eye-opening for me was that it wasn't just about my 10 by 10 cubicle that I was working out of in this space, that this had repercussions for the high-rise co-op buildings around me, and that that it had a whole history that went on for a decade before that had just kind of been erased from the public memory. And so and I think to go back to this conversation about success, right, and measuring success, and even though we didn't, get to keep studios at low rent at the end of the day, there was a success in the sense that we were able to reach out to several different communities within, both the environmental justice nonprofit, the community of residents that lived in the neighborhood, the larger community that we were able to access through the state senator's office, through Bill Perkins' office, and just meeting people and having that conversation go on the public record. So that was a win. I will say that. So I think it's just about thinking about the artist community as not just the artist community, but the people who live there, and the people who live there before, and thinking long term, 10, 50 years down the road, who's going to live here when will this problem still be here?
Agreed. And I do think as much as we're trying to think about how we can keep our real estate and keep that for art and maintain it, really thinking about how we can serve, because we do have a lot of assets, and to serve the Northwest Bushwick Coalition has, I think you get what you give in a lot of ways, and if you allow other communities to come in, other political organizations, I don't think arts organizations can think of the fine arts as an isolated thing, but art spaces, I think, need to think of themselves for social engagement purposes. I think would be a big help to all of us, to the arts sector and all others. Are there any other questions? Got one over there.
I have a small voice, so I need the microphone. I was in a conversation with someone recently, and she is a building owner in Bushwick. And I'm curious about that. How do you go about buying a building? And she said that it really is just all cash transactions now. And I thought to myself, well, how then is that even possible for artists to do that? It's so fast moving. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Like how, as art organizations, especially if you're cooperatives where you have a lot of different people involved in the purchase and so forth, how do you move quickly enough to get what you want?
Well, this is as a person who's working with two organizations that rent. This is something I've been trying to crack myself, and it's a highly competitive environment for sure. It's not easy for arts organizations that just have human capital and artistic capital to transform that into cash capital. Planning, I think, does go a long way towards getting there. A lot of it is looking at the different kinds of information that's out there and the different kinds of support groups that are out there. The city certainly wants to do a lot to help. Philanthropic individuals were brought up. I would, when I meet one of those, it'll be great. There's also a great deal of, foundational support. The Nonprofit Finance Fund, for one, is an organization that helps both with consulting on long-term fiscal planning and also does help with loans. So that's a private, I believe they're a 501c3 foundation to do that sort of thing. All the same at the end of the day, how do you turn that into a down payment? My opinion is that to a great extent we do have to look at crowdsourcing. That crowdsourcing is a real tool because we're looking at communities where no one individual has a whole lot of leverage. So I'm actually particularly interested in seeing where the real estate investment cooperative goes with this, because that's kind of their whole premise. And to my knowledge, it's not a super tested premise either. So what they're looking at is how can we create a crowdsourced model towards buying real estate for artists. Those are some ideas that I have about that.
I'll just add to that by saying when we think about, just set aside the affordability factor for a moment and whether or not as individuals or as entities we have sufficient funds to put a down payment on a building. Years go by and we may have thought what was once, wow, that's so expensive, no way. A few years down the road, you're like, wow, that was a great deal, crazy. I just thought we'd reached some artificial height and it's still growing, right? So year on year, we keep reminding, I think many of us continue to have that experience around real estate in New York. So thinking about that for a moment, to my mind, that means managing our own expectations to some extent about time and about goals. When we're thinking ahead for a while, what might seem like, wow, I don't want to do this in a few years, I need to do it now. That's not realistic. What's more realistic is maybe thinking about the experiences we've had where how quickly time goes by and what a good deal was at a certain point is now not a good deal anymore. When in reality, it might still be a good deal, just not compared to the past, but compared to the future, it probably will be. So that's asset building. And in terms of asset building and thinking about that, if individuals or collectives or organizations can think in longer-term goals about what it means to get to the point of being able to make that down payment and or build an asset, and then think about the steps necessary to getting there, then it's a little bit more actionable than the frustration around the imminent fear of displacement and the loss of your place in the community that you're in. So I would only add to Nat's comments by saying managing our own expectations and wrapping our arms around process is something that's going to happen regardless, and that's worthwhile, I think.
We've got another question up here.
I just wanted to continue on the subject with Shawn. My question is, what are some of the financing tools, you mentioned something about financing tools that small groups of people could use to, develop a mission, a mission-driven real estate venture, small, like 4 people, half a dozen. What are some of the tools that we can use, the financing tools?
Collectives of, my experience is not in collectives of individuals. My experience is in real estate developers utilizing larger scale financing tools like low-income housing tax credits, historic tax credits, new market tax credits, lenders and investors who buy into those tax credits and or provide additional financing through programs and or public partners who have different types of financing tools and programs that are competitive or eligibility based, foundations who care about those. So in that regard, my work is in a different area. That being said, as Nat has said, and as I think you've heard everybody on the panel today say, there are power in numbers. When individuals and or organizations or consortium come together with shared values and go through that process of assessing what does it mean to have shared goals, do we really have that, and then perhaps get into a position where they are a formal entity, then suddenly you're dealing with a different eligibility issue. You're not just individuals that want to pool their funds together to purchase something. In that regard, you've heard some ideas today about leveraging your finance, perhaps getting into crowdsourcing, perhaps getting into better terms on financing than you might get as an individual, going to not just commercial banks, but perhaps if you're an entity that has some mission associated with it, or community partnerships, perhaps you can get into your community lending versus your commercial lending areas, which have different rates. And again, as Nat has pointed out, I think we have to really manage our expectations around philanthropic entities, foundations with very strict guidelines and boards that they report to on how they're utilizing those strict resources. There's just not a lot in that regard that's available to consortiums. If you're an organization, if we're talking about a cultural organization that's part of a community, then perhaps there are more available. Again, things, as Nat has said, nonprofit finance fund and other types of lenders, but inevitably what it comes down to is how much debt are you taking on? And if you can whack away at that debt and reduce the amount of debt by having other types of either free capital in the form of foundation funds or contributed equity from you and your partners or a foundation or a impact investor, whatever it might be, somehow you got to get to the point where when you're in operations, your operational costs and burden are not going to put the sustainability at risk. So it's about debt. And affordability and debt are very interconnected. So I just suggest that you think a little bit about what does it mean to reduce debt and how many tools are available. I don't know if I'm being too helpful with it. We can talk after, but it's not really my world in that regard.